The snow had come early that year, thick and wet, clinging to the empty fences and sagging rooftops like it meant to stay. Wind howled low across the open land, dragging the cold deep into the bones of the earth and anything unlucky enough to be above it. Frost feathered the edges of the window glass like the breath of ghosts. In the dark, before dawn, light from the fire had nearly gone out, leaving the corners of the cabin in silence and shadow. Miriam sat on the floor beside the stove, the last ember flickering orange between the blackened logs. Her dress was damp where she had knelt too long, trying to coax heat from what was left. Her hands, red and raw, pressed together with a prayer she hadn't spoken aloud in months. She wasn't sure if she still believed in the shape of those words. Her lips were too cracked to say them anyway. Behind her, two small bodies huddled together beneath a frayed quilt on the cot. Neither stirred. She'd told them stories the night before, soft made-up things about cities by the ocean and horses that could fly and watch their eyes close before the hunger could wake again. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, not since she'd boiled down the last of the beans into a thin gray broth and poured it out equally between them. She remembered the taste, nothing but salt and surrender. Her husband Saul had died in early autumn, kicked by a mule that had always been mean. He went down in the field with no one but God watching. By the time the neighbor rode over, the man was already cooling and the dirt flies settling on the blood like it belonged there. The burial had been quiet. No preacher. Just Miriam and the boys and the wind. Since then, time had become a slow, dragging thing. A kind of grief that sat heavy, not loud. She'd tried to tend the garden through the last of the frost, tried to stretch the sacks of flour and cornmeal Saul had traded for. But the numbers didn't lie. Winter was here and there was nothing left to sell. The fire cracked weak and thin. She moved stiffly, taking the small hatchet from beside the stove. The last of the chopped wood was gone, burned 2 nights ago. That left the table. Or the rocker. She stared at the rocker soles, its slats worn down by years of use, the seat still shaped to his frame. She reached for it, then pulled her hand back. Not yet. Instead, she opened the door to the lean-to and stepped into the wind. Snow swept across the yard, covering the chopped ruts and hoofprints like none of it had ever mattered. The trees past the fence line swayed under the weight of snow, dark and still. Her coat, patched and too thin, caught the wind like a rag on a line. She held the hatchet low and walked toward the outbuilding, the one Saul had used for tool repair. Maybe there was wood back there. Maybe not. She didn't hear the hooves at first, just the wind loud in her ears. Then came the muffled thud of something heavy, steady, approaching through the snow. She stopped, squinted into the morning light. A horse. A man. Coat turned up, high hat pulled low. Snow clung to the brim like frost on a grave marker. He pulled the reins and slowed near the split rail fence. Didn't speak right away. Just watched her with the stillness of someone used to waiting. His horse stamped and breathed steam into the cold. "You're Miriam Jessup?" he asked finally. Her throat was too tight to answer. She nodded once. "Name's Colum Avery. Your husband owed a man up in Whitfield. I bought the debt. Came to settle it." The words landed like stones. Miriam didn't flinch, but something inside her shifted. Of course Saul owed someone. Of course the man had sold it off. Death didn't wipe a slate clean. It just handed the chalk to someone else. "You come to take the land?" she asked, voice low and hoarse. Colum shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just came to see what's what." She stared at him, then back toward the cabin. Smoke rose, now faint and thin, from the stovepipe. "You're wasting your time," she said. "Maybe?" The horse shifted. Colum reached into his coat, pulled out a small cloth bundle, and tossed it toward her. It landed in the snow at her feet with a soft thump. She didn't move. "Dried meat and matches," he said. "Looks like your boys need better fire." Then he turned the horse and rode off down the trail, not looking back once. She stood there until the wind numbed her face, until she could no longer see him through the white. Then she picked up the bundle, held it tight to her chest, and walked back inside. The fire came back to life slowly. She used one match, striking it with care, and watched the flame catch on the dry bark of a broken crate she'd found behind the shed. Smoke curled up in soft threads, warm and sharp. She didn't speak as she worked, just moved through the motions like muscle remembered before thought did. The bundle Column had left held jerky, wrapped tight in waxed paper, and a handful of matchsticks bound with string. She broke off a piece of meat with trembling fingers and brought it to her lips. She didn't eat it. Not yet. Instead, she walked to the cot, knelt beside it, and placed the strip between her sons. Eli, the older, stirred first, 9, lean and watchful even in sleep, his eyes opened gray and wide. He didn't speak either, just looked at her, then down at the food, and waited. She nodded once. He took it. The younger Sam still slept, face turned toward the wall. He'd eat later when his brother nudged him awake with quiet urgency. They always took care of each other like that, without needing to be told. Miriam sat back on her heels. The warmth of the fire reached her now, brushing her face like something half remembered. A sound caught in her throat. Not a sob, not quite. Just the release of breath she hadn't known she'd been holding since the man on the horse had left. Colum Avery. The name meant nothing. The gesture did. She didn't expect him to return, but he did. 2 days later, just before dusk, she saw him again, same coat, same hat, horse steaming in the cold. He brought a sack this time, meal, salt, flour, a small tin of coffee, and a coil of rope. Said he'd traded a saddle for the lot. Didn't ask for thanks. Just glanced around the place, took in the crooked fence, the woodpile that barely covered the stump. "You got any help coming?" he asked. "No. Family. None living. Neighbors. Too far off. They got their own troubles." He nodded like that made sense. "You'll freeze out here alone." She didn't answer. He didn't push. Instead, he stepped down from the horse and began unloading the sack near the door. She didn't stop him. Let him stack the supplies where she could reach them. Let him take in the thin trail of smoke from the chimney, the washed clothes stiff and unmoving on the line. When he looked at her again, his eyes weren't cold, just clear, like someone who'd spent a long time learning how to see and keep quiet about it. "I'll be back in a few days," he said. "You need anything, leave a rag tied on the fence post." And he left again. He came when he said he would. Sometimes with feed for the mule, sometimes with news from the nearest town, sometimes with nothing but silence and a willingness to fix what he saw needed fixing. He replaced the broken hinge on the barn door, restrung the trap line, sharpened the hatchet, never lingered long, always left before nightfall. Miriam didn't ask why. Winter deepened. Snow climbed the window panes and nights grew longer than the days. But the cabin, for the first time since Saul had died, began to feel less like a tomb and more like a place where breath still meant something. One afternoon she found Callum splitting wood out back. No invitation. Just their shirt sleeves rolled up, arms moving steady and slow. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the cold, and watched for a long while. "You do this for everyone who can't pay a debt?" she asked. He didn't stop chopping. "No." "Why, you—" He paused, then rested the axe head in the snow, looked at her with a quiet she wasn't used to. "My mother," he said. "She raised 3 of us alone. Father died in a mine collapse in Utah. No one helped her. Should—" Miriam didn't reply. She just nodded once and went back inside. Later that evening, after the boys had gone to sleep, she sat near the fire mending a sleeve. Colum knocked once and stepped in, brushing snow from his boots. He held out a tin mug, steaming. "Coffee," he said. She took it with both hands, the heat blooming through her fingers. The fire crackled softly. For the first time in weeks, no wind screamed against the windows. "Saul ever talk about leaving?" Callum asked, voice low. "All the time," she said. "Said we'd go south. New Mexico, maybe. Where winters weren't so cruel. Why didn't you?" She smiled without joy. "Because talk's cheap, and moving's hard." He nodded, didn't ask more. The silence between them felt real, not empty, not awkward, just lived in. And something shifted then. Not loudly, not with lightning, just a small, steady thing like ice thawing beneath snow. By mid-January the light began to stretch again, only by minutes, but Miriam noticed. She noticed, too, how the boys' cheeks had filled out slightly, how they no longer cried in their sleep from hunger or cold. She watched the way Eli followed Callum, at a distance, when he came to repair the wagon axle or shovel the packed snow from the roof, trying to mimic the angle of his shoulders, the slow, sure steps. Callum never said much to the children, but when he did, his voice was gentle and without effort, like he'd been born knowing how to speak softly in a hard world. It became natural somehow for him to return every few days. He brought odds and ends, stayed longer now, enough to share a meal or warm his hands by the stove before heading back to his camp along the ridge. He'd cleared out an old trapper's shelter up there, set up a small stove, and made it livable. Miriam had never seen it, but Sam once asked if he could go too, if Callum had a bed made of bear fur and stars carved into his ceiling. That night Callum laughed deep and low, the kind of laugh that made the air warmer. Miriam laughed too. It surprised her. The days moved forward with the slow rhythm of survival. Miriam worked hard, harder than she ever had with Saul, because there was no one else to do it. She cut wood until her palms bled. She hauled water until her shoulders throbbed. She fixed the hinge on the henhouse, patched the roof with oilcloth trapped rabbits, and learned to gut them without flinching. Every ache, every split nail, every bruise on her shins was a mark of something she could claim. Callum saw it. He never said she was strong. He never said much at all. But he stepped back when she reached for a tool. He let her try first, and when she failed he showed her once slow and patient and let her try again. One morning, while they worked together repairing the back gate, she asked about his family. Not to be polite, just because the question had been living in her ribs for weeks. He didn't look up. "You ever hear of Tularosa?" She shook her head. "My father had land there. Pecans, mesquite, raised cattle, fought in the war before that. Got his shoulder torn up in Missouri. Still worked the land until he died. And your mother? Hard as nails. Didn't smile much, but she could play the fiddle like a ghost. Said it kept her from turning to stone." Miriam smiled. "Where are your people now?" "Buried. Scattered. Some back east, I guess. None I talked to." She waited, giving the silence room to breathe. Then she asked the question she hadn't wanted to. "You married?" His hand stilled on the latch, then moved again, tightening the bolt. "No. Was close once. She married someone steadier. A storekeeper. Had walls and a porch and a name that meant something." Miriam didn't know what to say to that. So she didn't. She just reached for the next board and held it while he nailed it in place. As winter leaned toward spring, the land shifted. The snow melted slow, leaving behind mud and the smell of something waking up beneath the earth. One afternoon, Miriam and Callum stood near the barn, watching the boys chase each other through puddles, laughing until they coughed. Callum looked at her, his eyes lined and wind-burned. "You thought about what comes next?" She looked at the fields, still brown and bare. "I plant. I wait. I keep them alive. You'll need help. I can manage. You have so far. but it'll get harder before it gets easy." She didn't answer, just wrapped her arms around herself against the wind. Colum stepped closer, not touching her, just there beside her. "You don't have to decide anything now. But if you wanted someone to stay just for the planting or longer, I wouldn't go." The words sat between them like kindling that hadn't yet been lit. He didn't reach for her. He didn't ask again. Just tipped his hat and walked back toward his horse, leaving tracks in the mud that filled with water behind him. That night, after the boys were asleep, Miriam stood at the stove, staring at the last bit of embers. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold. She walked outside. The air was sharp, clean. Stars overhead like nail holes punched into the sky. She tied a strip of cloth blue, torn from the hem of her dress, around the fence post. And waited. He came at first light. The frost still clung to the fence rails in brittle white lace, and the sky was barely pink over the hills. Miriam had not slept. She had sat up through the night, watching the shadows shift across the floorboards, listening to Sam murmur in his dreams, to the slow breathing of Eli curled beside him. The fabric she'd tied to the post moved gently in the breeze. She watched it through the window as though it might change its mind. But Callum rode in just after dawn, reins loose in his hand, eyes already on the house. He didn't smile. Neither did she. He dismounted and stood with one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn, waiting. She opened the door and stepped outside, boots crunching in the thawing ground, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "I wasn't sure," he said quietly, "what the rag meant." She looked at him, then back at the horizon where the light was crawling up slow and gold over the ridge. "It means you don't have to ask again." Callum exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for days. "You sure?" he asked. "You say the word and I'll ride off?" No pride in it. She shook her head once. "No. Just don't expect me to owe you." "I don't." "Then come inside," she said. "The boys'll be up soon. You can share the coffee this time." The changes came slow and quiet, not all at once. Callum didn't move in, not formally. But he stayed longer now, helped fix the fence line, cleared out the field with Eli dragging stones behind him like a team of oxen. He traded one of his rifles for seed and shared from a pile of nails he'd been carrying around in an old tobacco tin. He slept out back in the woodshed until she cleared a space in the barn loft and left a folded blanket there without saying why. Miriam didn't speak much about the future. But one day she began scrubbing the walls with vinegar and water, scouring off soot and smoke from months of fire. Another day she made biscuits from scratch. Sam called them rocks, then ate 4. She laughed harder than she had in over a year. It was the sound that did it, her laughter. That was the night Callum kissed her. It was brief, gentle. His hand cupped the side of her face, fingers rough from years of work but careful, like she might pull away. She didn't. She leaned into it, not with desperation but with a kind of stillness, a kind of peace she hadn't known her body still carried. They didn't speak about it the next day. They didn't need to. Spring came slow and wet. The fields turned soft and green at the edges, and the mule's belly began to swell with grain. The boys helped plant Eli with a furrow stick, Sam dropping seed with more imagination than accuracy. Miriam watched them, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, arms sore from days of tilling. She felt herself growing stronger alongside the land. One afternoon, as the sun spilled across the porch, Callum sat sharpening the axe and Miriam mended a tear in Eli's shirt. She looked over at him, the way the sun lit his shoulders, the ease and the set of his jaw. "Why'd you really stay?" she asked. He paused, blade in his lap. "I told you. I wanted to help." "That all?" Callum looked at her then. "No. You looked like someone who still had more to lose." "I knew what that looked like. I figured if I could hold it off even a little, I would." She set the shirt down. "You think I still have more to lose?" He gave a small nod. Yeah. But now you've got more to fight with, too. She looked at him a long time, then reached across and took his hand rough and broad and held it in hers. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't anymore. Late that summer they went into town together, first time since Saul's burial. Miriam wore her hair braided and tied back with a ribbon Sam had found in the barn rafters. Eli walked beside Callum like he'd been doing it all his life. No one in town asked about them directly. A few eyes lingered, but no one spoke against it. They bought sugar and tobacco nails and a tin of blue paint. Later, after the boys were asleep, Miriam dipped a small brush into the paint and slowly wrote a name across the mailbox, Jessup Avery. The letters were uneven. The wind was warm. The days grew long, thick with the hum of cicadas and the scent of sun-warmed grass. The soil had given back what they asked of it, barely but enough. Corn stalks stood knee-high and proud beans climbed the twine Miriam strung with her own hands, and the hens had begun to lay again. It wasn't abundance, but it was honest. Enough to last the winter, maybe more. Callum built a lean to beside the barn for tools. He shaped the beams with care, not speaking much while he worked. Miriam watched him through the window, sometimes wondering what kind of life he'd left behind before drifting into hers. He still hadn't said whether he planned to stay come fall. She hadn't asked. But each morning he rose with them, took his coffee black and early, and walked into the field like he belonged there. That was answer enough for now. One morning Ellie came in wide-eyed and breathless, his hands smeared with something dark. "Mama," he said, "there's a man out by the well. Says he knew Papa." Callum stood before she did. Not fast, not loud. Just stood like a man used to the weight of trouble. Miriam stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun. The man at the well was tall, with a red kerchief knotted at his throat and boots too clean for this land. A horse stood behind him, glossy and expensive. The man tipped his hat when he saw her. "Mrs. Jessup," he said. "Or is it Mrs. Avery now?" She didn't answer. "I'm Clay Merton. I rode with Saul a while back, down near Fort Stockton. Heard he passed. Sorry to hear it." She crossed her arms, careful not to let her stance betray the tremor she felt in her gut. "That was months ago. You come all this way just to pay respect?" He smiled, thin and slow. "Not exactly. Saul and I had business. He sold me a claim, signed it right before he died. Seems he never mentioned it." Callum stepped forward, slow and even. "You bring papers." Merton didn't look at him. "Got 'em with me. But I didn't ride out here to start a fight. Just thought the lady should know." "What claim?" Miriam asked. "Mineral rights. That ridge behind your north field. He sold it to me outright. Said he needed cash to get through the harvest. Poor bastard didn't make it." Miriam's heart sank. She didn't know the ridge held anything worth mining, but even the idea of losing land felt like a knife slipping into something vital. "I want to see the paper," she said. "Happy to oblige," Merton said, reaching into his coat and drawing out a folded sheet. She didn't take it. Callum did. His eyes scanned it slowly. "It's signed," he said, "but not notarized. No witness. No seal." "Didn't figure we needed a court when the ground's still empty," Merton replied. "It won't be for long," Callum said, folding the paper and handing it back. "You're not putting a single stake in this land." Merton's smile stayed fixed, but his voice cooled. "That paper says different." Callum stepped in close. Not threatening, not loud, just solid. "Then take it to a judge. But don't come back here playing land baron with a dead man's lie." Merton looked between them. "You planning to fight me for it?" Miriam spoke then, her voice steady. "We don't fight liars. We bury them." The silence after that was heavy. Merton clicked his tongue, mounted his horse, and rode off in a slow cloud of dust. He didn't look back. That night Callum sat outside with a rifle across his knees, watching the tree line until the moon rose. He didn't speak of it, but Miriam knew he hadn't slept. She brought him a blanket and stood beside him a long while. "Think he'll come back?" she asked. "Not alone." She nodded. "I'm not afraid." "I know," he said. "That's the part that scares me." She smiled just a little, then leaned against him, shoulder to shoulder, two shadows on a porch built by calloused hands and hard-won days. She whispered, "We'll hold this place." He didn't answer, just reached for her hand and held it tight. 2 weeks passed with no sign of Clay Merton, but the ridge stayed in Miriam's mind like a bruise beneath the skin, tender when pressed. She didn't speak of it again, not to Callum, not even to herself in those long moments before sleep. She just worked harder, woke earlier, cooked more, watched the boys with a quiet fierceness that made her hands still when Sam so much as scraped a knee. Then one morning a rider appeared on the horizon. Not Merton, but a deputy from the county seat, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and boots caked in trail dust. He came bearing folded documents and an order to appear. Not a trial, not yet. Just a hearing. Merton had filed the claim after all. Inside the cabin, Miriam read the papers 3 times. Her name was on them. So was Saul's, though he'd been in the ground long enough for the wood of his cross to split in the rain. She looked at the deputy, who avoided her eyes. "I've got 2 boys and a field that's just taken seed," she said. "You tell me how I'm supposed to leave that behind for some courthouse desk." "I just deliver the writ, ma'am," he said. "Not the choices." Callum stood by the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. After the deputy rode off, he spoke. "We can fight it. I don't have money for a lawyer. You've got truth, and land, and a name worth more than his." She looked down at the paper. "I've also got fear." Callum stepped closer. "Then let's walk into it together." They rode out 3 days later. Left the boys with the Crawfords' neighbors 3 miles east, who owed Callum a favor and repaid it gladly. Eli didn't cry, but he gripped Callum's hand hard enough to make his knuckles go white. Sam handed Miriam a smooth stone he'd carried in his pocket since winter. "It's lucky," he said. "You hold it tight when you talk to the judge." "I will, baby," she said, kissing his forehead. The ride to the county seat was quiet. Open land rolled by in waves, pastures spotted with grazing cattle, gullies deep with rain. It felt like traveling through another world, one where names and land and rights were all tangled in ink and paper instead of sweat and bone. At the courthouse they sat in a room that smelled of varnish and old tobacco. Merton showed up in a fresh coat, flanked by a lawyer from Austin who looked like he'd never missed a meal. Miriam felt out of place, but not small. She wore her best dress and kept her back straight. The hearing was short. Merton's lawyer talked fast, quoted laws. Miriam didn't know, pointed at the paper like it was gospel. Then Callum stood and spoke plain about Saul's habits, about the lack of seal, about the lie buried in a rushed signature made by a man already halfway to dying. When they asked Miriam to speak, she rose slow. "My husband," she said, voice even, "would have sold his name before he sold that ridge. He talked about that land like it was a promise. He built his grave with the same hands that fenced it. That's the truth. You can write over it if you want, but it'll still be the truth." Silence followed. The judge, an old man with watery eyes and a scar along his cheek, studied her for a long time. Then he dismissed the claim. Merton stood up too fast. His chair scraped. He didn't argue, just turned and walked out, jaw clenched, his lawyer trailing behind. Outside, Miriam sat on the courthouse steps and didn't say a word. Callum waited beside her. She reached into her pocket and felt the smooth stone, warm now from her grip. What if he tries something else, she asked. Then we'll meet him again, Callum said. You weren't meant to bow, Miriam. You were made to stand. She looked out over the street where wagons rattled and boots kicked up dust, where men passed with hats tipped and no idea what it had cost her just to be there. She wasn't trembling. Not anymore. I don't want to fight forever, she said quietly. You won't, Callum replied, but you'll never be the kind of woman who runs. Not anymore. That night, they rode home under a sky full of stars. She didn't sleep during the ride. She just watched the road stone still in her palm, Callum beside her, the house waiting beyond the ridge. The house came into view just past midnight, quiet beneath the pale wash of moonlight. The chimney stood still, no smoke rising yet. The fields were dark rows of young green, curling from the earth, like questions still waiting to be answered. Miriam dismounted first, her legs stiff from the long ride boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. Callum moved without a word, unbuckling the saddle, leading the horse to the lean-to. He worked like it was still daylight, like the stars above weren't watching. Miriam stood a while staring at the shape of the home she had nearly lost, not to fire or flood, but to the slow erasure of paper and lies. Inside, the boys were asleep in a tangled pile of quilts on the floor. Eli stirred as she bent to brush hair from his brow, mumbling something in the soft half-language of dreams. Sam slept hard, his fingers curled tight around an old spoon he'd once declared a sword. She kissed them both and pulled the blanket higher. Callum stood in the doorway, hat in hand. You need rest, she said. So do you? She nodded. Neither moved. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of every choice made, every step taken. He looked at her like he was still asking, still willing to walk away if she said so. But she didn't. She crossed the space between them, slow and sure, took the hat from his hands and hung it on the nail beside the door. You can stay inside tonight, she said. The days that followed felt different. Something had shifted, not loud, not sudden, just the way the air changes before a summer storm. Callum didn't sleep in the loft again. He rose early like always and took his place beside her as they moved through the rhythm of each day, feeding the mule, mending the fences, watching the sky for signs of rain or something worse. The boys stopped calling him Mr. Callum. It became just Callum and sometimes Daddy when Sam forgot himself and reached for a hand without thinking. One evening in late July, the four of them sat on the porch after supper. Fireflies blinked in the grass, and the air was thick with the smell of sage and dust. Miriam rocked slowly in the chair Saul had built years ago. Her fingers worked an embroidery hoop, though the pattern had long been forgotten. Callum held Sam in his lap, listening to Eli read from a tattered primer found in the church attic. The boy stumbled through the words, frowning, then correcting himself with a stubborn shake of the head. You ever teach a boy to read before? Miriam asked, her voice soft. No, Callum said, but I guess I'm learning. She smiled. You're a patient man. I wasn't. Not for a long time. What changed? He looked out over the land, rows neat and green beneath the fading light. I found something worth staying for. They sat in the quiet a while longer. Then Eli looked up from the book. Mama. Yes, baby. Are you and Callum gonna get married? Miriam froze for a second, caught off guard by the bluntness only children could carry. She looked at Callum, whose face had gone still. Then she turned back to her son. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but we're family either way. Eli nodded like that was enough. It was. Callum didn't speak, but when she reached for his hand, he took it without hesitation. A month later, after the last row of beans had been harvested and stored, Callum took her riding to the edge of the property line. The ridge stretched beyond them, golden and dry, the wind stirring the tall grass like a whisper. From here the house was just a small shape against the wide sky. He pulled something from his coat pocket. A ring. simple hammered silver, the kind a man might buy from a traveling blacksmith or trade for, with a favor and a quiet promise. "I won't kneel," he said. "Not because I'm proud. I just want to meet you eye to eye." Miriam's throat tightened. "You sure?" she asked. "Every day I wake up here I get surer." He placed the ring in her palm. "You've already built the life," he said. "I just want to live it with you." She closed her hand around it, heart loud in her chest. Then she nodded, slow and steady, as the wind lifted her hair and the sun broke across the hilltop. They married that fall. No preacher, no papers, just hands joined beneath the cottonwood tree out back, with Alien Sam watching close and grinning wide. The field behind them was bare now, resting, but inside the hearth burned bright. A cradle stood beside the boy's cot, empty still, but waiting. Waiting, like everything else on that land, for the next season, the next storm, the next quiet joy. The ridge still held its silence, but the house no longer stood alone. Subscribe and let the frontier unfold slowly.